A privileged socialite assaulted a royal guard outside Buckingham Palace, believing her wealth would shield her from consequences. But his response left her trembling and taught the stunned crowd a powerful lesson about honor they'll never forget. Here's how this shocking confrontation unfolded. The crisp autumn morning at Windsor Castle painted a postcard-perfect scene. Golden sunlight dancing off ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of both dignity and disgrace. Clusters of crimson and amber leaves skittered across the immaculate courtyard, where Reginald Morrison, a decorated royal guard with 15 years of service, stood at his post. His ceremonial rifle gleamed in the early light, each polished surface reflecting the dedication he'd shown since his first day of military service. The historic tranquility was about to be shattered by the arrival of someone who measured worth not in centuries of tradition, but in zeros on a bank statement. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first warning came in the form of squealing brakes as an Aston Martin DB11, in a shade of metallic champagne that practically screamed new money, screeched to a halt in the private parking area. The vehicle's aggressive arrival sent a flock of pigeons scattering, their wings catching the morning light as they fled what was about to unfold. Isabella Blackwood Pierce emerged from the luxury vehicle like a tornado wrapped in Burberry, her Louis Vuitton handbag swinging with the practiced authority of someone who'd never heard the word no and accepted it. At 45, she'd spent the last decade cultivating the perfect image of London high society, though her nouveau riche status clung to her like the overwhelmingly expensive perfume she wore. The click of her Louboutin heels against the centuries-old cobblestones echoed through the courtyard like a countdown to confrontation. Each step carried the entitled confidence of a woman who'd married into money and had spent every day since ensuring the world never forgot it. Her perfectly styled ash-blonde hair barely moved in the autumn breeze, held in place by what was probably half a can of premium hairspray and an unshakable sense of superiority. "This is absolutely preposterous." Her voice shattered the morning's peace, causing several nearby tourists to jump. "What do you mean my private tour was cancelled? Do you have any idea who my husband is?" The question hung in the air like her signature scent, expensive, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. Martha Higgins, the senior tour coordinator who'd served Windsor Castle for over 2 decades, stood her ground with the patience of someone who'd weathered countless storms of entitlement. Her sensible shoes and well-worn name badge spoke of years of genuine service, a sharp contrast to Isabella's carefully curated facade of importance. "I apologize, Mrs. Blackwood Pierce," Martha began, her professional tone carrying the weight of 20 years' experience. "But as I explained in our email, the East Wing is closed this morning for a royal function. Security protocols are absolute when it comes to such matters. We'd be happy to reschedule your tour for tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Isabella's perfectly manicured hand clutched her pearls, real, of course, and recently purchased from Asprey, in theatrical shock. "I don't do tomorrow. Do you have any concept of how busy my schedule is? I have a luncheon with the Duchess of Hampshire's second cousin. This tour was meant to give me something impressive to discuss over champagne. Although," she added with a dismissive glance around the courtyard, "I'm beginning to wonder if there's anything truly impressive about this place at all." The growing audience to this display of entitlement reacted in various ways. A young family from Japan quietly shuffled away from the scene, the mother whispering something to her children as they sought refuge near the castle gardens. The father bowed slightly in apology, though he had nothing to apologize for. 2 elderly British gentlemen, both wearing veterans' pins that spoke of service in conflicts Isabella couldn't name, exchanged knowing glances as her voice reached new heights. "I demand to speak to whoever's in charge." She thrust her phone forward, its screen displaying a digital business card that proclaimed her positions on 3 different charity boards, positions purchased with donations rather than earned through dedication. "My husband manages investments for half of Kensington's elite. Surely there's someone here with enough authority to understand that rules are meant to be flexible." She emphasized the last word with the same tone she used to negotiate upgrades at 5-star hotels. Martha's diplomatic smile remained fixed, though decades of service had taught her to recognize the mounting signs of an impending incident. Her eyes briefly met those of a nearby security officer, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. They'd seen this type before. "The castle's security protocols are non-negotiable, madam. Perhaps you'd be interested in our exclusive evening tour options." But Isabella had already spotted her new target. Reginald stood at attention nearby, his bearskin cap and pristine uniform representing everything she was determined to overcome: real authority, earned respect, and unwavering dignity. Her expression shifted from mere annoyance to calculated determination as she redirected her assault, leaving Martha to shake her head in silent warning. A crowd began to gather, sensing the impending drama as Isabella Blackwood-Pierce, self-proclaimed Queen of London's nouveau riche, prepared to learn a lesson about the difference between purchased power and earned respect. The autumn breeze carried whispers of anticipation through the courtyard, rustling the leaves that would soon witness an encounter none present would ever forget. Isabella's Louboutin heels struck the cobblestones with military precision, though not the kind that commanded respect. Each click-clack announced her approach to Reginald's post, her designer perfume arriving seconds before she did, a cloud of expensive notes that seemed to assault the crisp autumn air itself. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying the same tone she used to summon waiters at the Ritz. "Yes, you, the one with the charming little hat. I require your assistance with something rather urgent." She positioned herself directly in front of Reginald, deliberately entering his personal space with the entitled confidence of someone who viewed others as mere props in their personal theater. The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward with the discipline earned through years of military service. His ceremonial rifle gleamed in the strengthening morning light, each brass fitting telling its own story of dedication, stories Isabella was far too self-absorbed to read. A small group of American tourists had paused their photo-taking to watch the scene unfold. One mother quickly ushered her young daughter away, whispering, "That's not how we behave, sweetheart." The child's innocent question, "Why is that lady being so mean?" carried clearly across the courtyard, causing several onlookers to nod in agreement. "I said, I'm speaking to you," Isabella continued, waving her manicured hand in front of Reginald's face. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the light, each stone worth more than a week of his salary. "Is this part of your little performance? Playing statue while actual important people are being inconvenienced?" Two elderly couples who had been admiring the castle architecture now turned their full attention to the unfolding scene. One of the men, wearing a Royal Marines veteran's pin, shifted his weight slightly, his weathered face displaying the calm recognition of someone who understood exactly what Isabella was failing to grasp. "Look," she continued, adjusting her Burberry scarf with practiced flourish, "I understand you have your little routine here. It's quite picturesque, really, very—" She paused, searching for a word that dripped with enough condescension. "Quaint. But surely we can dispense with the theatrics for someone of my standing." The guard's posture remained perfect, though someone with military experience might have noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw, the only visible sign that he was indeed hearing every word. His bearskin cap cast a shadow across his face, but his eyes remained focused, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen real service, real commitment, real sacrifice. Isabella dug through her Louis Vuitton bag, producing a business card with the same flourish she used to present her platinum credit card at exclusive boutiques. "Isabella Blackwood-Pierce, chairman of the Kensington Heritage Society. My husband's firm manages portfolios for half of London's upper crust." She held the card up like a talisman, as if its embossed lettering could command the respect her behavior failed to earn. When the guard didn't react to her credentials, her perfectly plucked eyebrows furrowed in growing frustration. "Are you even listening to me? Because right now you're displaying absolutely atrocious customer service skills." She emphasized each word as if speaking to a particularly dim child. The crowd had grown larger, their morning tours temporarily forgotten as they watched entitled wealth collide with unwavering dignity. A group of British citizens stood nearby, their expressions darkening at her dismissive attitude toward their traditions. The veteran with the Royal Marines pin had been joined by another elderly gentleman wearing campaign medals that spoke of service and conflicts Isabella couldn't begin to comprehend. You know what? Her voice took on the sharp edge of someone unused to being ignored, someone who viewed silence as a personal insult rather than a sign of discipline. I don't think you're even a real soldier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No actual military man would just stand there while a lady of my status required assistance. She began circling Reginald like a predator, though her attempt at intimidation was somewhat undermined by the click of her designer heels against the ancient stones. Each step echoed with entitled authority, the same cadence she used when inspecting potential venues for her charity galas or examining staff at her country club. This whole thing is probably just for tourists, isn't it? Actors playing dress-up for the cameras? She leaned closer, her expensive perfume invading the space around them. And not very good actors at that. I've seen better performances at my daughter's private school productions. The guard's ceremonial rifle remained perfectly steady, its polished surface reflecting Isabella's contorted expression back at her, fracturing her carefully maintained facade into something closer to its true nature. The veteran shifted his weight again, years of military discipline barely containing his reaction to her words, his campaign medals clinking softly against each other, each one earned in moments of valor that Isabella's privileged world couldn't begin to comprehend. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Dad, why doesn't he say something back?" The father, dressed in a way that spoke of comfortable but earned success, knelt down and whispered something about respect and duty, concepts that seemed as foreign to Isabella as the idea that she might not be the most important person in any given situation. Isabella's hand tightened around her designer handbag, her knuckles whitening beneath her perfect manicure. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting shorter shadows across Windsor Castle's courtyard and illuminating the growing crowd of onlookers who watched her performance with a mixture of disgust and fascination. "Let me explain something to you about authority," she began, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that nonetheless carried across the courtyard like expensive poison. "Real authority comes from influence, from connections." She adjusted her Cartier watch, ensuring its diamonds caught the light. "I sit on the board of the Royal London Hospital's Charity Committee. I host galas that raise millions for children's causes." A group of British tourists had paused their photography session, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and anger as Isabella continued her tirade. An elderly woman in a barber jacket muttered something about new money, no class to her companion, who nodded sagely while clutching her own well-worn Heritage brand handbag. "Do you know what my husband said when I told him I was visiting today?" Isabella circled closer to Reginald, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. "He said, 'Darling, the palace staff will roll out the red carpet for you, but instead, I find myself dealing with—'" She gestured vaguely at his uniform. "This little pantomime." The ceremonial rifle in Reginald's hands remained perfectly steady, though something in his bearing had changed. It was subtle, imperceptible to someone like Isabella who measured worth in thread counts and table reservations. But the veterans in the crowd noticed. There was a presence now, a gravity that seemed to grow stronger with each insult, like steel being tempered in fire. "I mean, really," she continued, fishing her phone from her handbag, its case crafted from Italian leather and monogrammed with her initials in gold. "Should we call the actual authorities? I'm sure the real military would love to hear about how their costume department is treating distinguished visitors." A young couple who had been filming the scene on their phones slowly lowered their devices, something in the guard's bearing making them realize this wasn't entertainment. It was a display of everything wrong with the intersection of wealth and respect. The woman whispered something to her partner about feeling ashamed to watch. "You know what your problem is?" Isabella's voice took on the same tone she used when berating service staff at her country club. "You think this uniform, this little act of yours makes you special. But let me tell you something. I've seen better security guards at Harrods. At least they know how to treat their premium customers with proper respect." The veteran with the Royal Marines pin had moved closer now, his campaign medals catching the light. Each one told a story of real service, real sacrifice, concepts that seemed as foreign to Isabella as flying economy class. His weathered hands were clasped behind his back in a stance that spoke of years of military discipline, though his expression suggested he was witnessing something that tested that discipline sorely. "This is your final chance," Isabella announced, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Either drop this ridiculous charade and help me, or I'll ensure everyone knows how Windsor Castle treats its VIP visitors. I have connections at every major newspaper in London. One phone call and—" Her voice cut off abruptly as a young girl in the crowd asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mummy, why is that angry lady wearing such a scary face?" The innocent question hung in the air, highlighting the absurdity of Isabella's behavior with the clarity only a child's perspective could provide. But rather than causing her to reflect, the child's question only seemed to fuel Isabella's anger. Her face flushed deeper red, clashing with her expertly applied blusher, and her grip on her handbag tightened until the expensive leather creaked in protest. She was building toward something, a line even she hadn't dared cross until now. "You think you're better than me?" she hissed, her composure cracking like cheap veneer beneath premium paint. "Standing there in your costume, ignoring someone who spends more on afternoon tea than you probably make in a week?" Her free hand rose slowly, trembling with rage. The autumn sun caught her diamond rings, each one a glittering testament to the wealth she thought could shield her from consequences. The crowd held its collective breath, recognizing the moment when entitlement was about to collide head-on with immovable dignity. The veterans straightened instinctively, years of training telling them what was coming. A mother covered her child's eyes, while someone in the crowd murmured, "She wouldn't dare." But Isabella Blackwood Pierce, who had spent a decade buying her way into London's elite social circles, who measured worth in thread counts and vintage years, who had never been denied anything she demanded, was about to learn an unforgettable lesson about the difference between purchased status and earned respect. Her hand drew back, her expensive bracelet catching the light one final time, like a signal flare warning of impending disaster. The slap cracked across the courtyard like a gunshot, the sound echoing off Windsor Castle's ancient stones with an accusatory resonance. Isabella's manicured hand connected with Reginald's cheek in a strike that seemed to freeze time itself. Several tourists gasped, a child began to cry, and someone in the crowd muttered "bloody hell" under their breath. The sound hung in the autumn air like a death knell for propriety, a moment of violence that would forever alter the morning's peaceful facade. The guard's head hadn't moved an inch. Her hand had struck true, leaving an angry red mark on his cheek, but his posture remained unchanged, his discipline unshaken. If anything, his bearing seemed to grow more powerful, more present in the shocked silence that followed. Isabella stood there, her hand still raised, a mix of triumph and uncertainty flickering across her expertly made-up face. Perhaps she had expected him to break character, to crumble under her assault. Instead, she found herself confronting something she'd never encountered before. Dignity that couldn't be slapped away, strength that had nothing to do with power over others. "There," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence, wavering like a poorly made counterfeit of authority. "Maybe now you'll learn to show proper respect to—" "Ma'am." The word cut through the courtyard like a blade, quiet, but carrying the authority of command. The guard's eyes, which had remained fixed forward throughout her entire tirade, now turned to meet hers directly. In that gaze was not anger, not hatred, but something far more terrifying. The calm, measured assessment of a warrior who had faced far worse than an entitled socialite. A pin dropping would have echoed in the silence that followed. Even the ever-present pigeons seemed to pause their cooing, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. The red mark on the guard's cheek stood out against his skin, not as a sign of weakness, but as evidence of Isabella's own lack of dignity. "In my 14 years of service," Reginald continued, his voice carrying the weight of real authority, "I've survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, faced insurgent fire in Iraq, and lost brothers in combat." His words were measured, precise, each one landing like a hammer blow against Isabella's crumbling facade. "The uniform you mock has been soaked with the blood of those who died defending the very freedom you abuse." Isabella took an involuntary step backward, her designer heel catching on the ancient cobblestones. The guard's presence seemed to fill the entire courtyard now, his bearing no longer ceremonial but radiating the true military authority that lay beneath the tradition. "This costume, as you call it," he continued, his voice remaining level but carrying an intensity that made Isabella's earlier shouting seem childish in comparison, "is worn with the pride of centuries of service. Each button, each medal, each crease represents the sacrifice of those who stood guard not just over a palace, but over the principles of duty, honor, and respect." The elderly veteran had moved closer, standing at parade rest, his own service medals glinting in the late morning sun. His presence added silent testimony to the guard's words, decades of shared sacrifice and understanding bridging the generations between them. Isabella's mouth opened and closed, her carefully maintained composure dissolving under the weight of real authority. Her hand, the one she had used to strike him, now hung limply at her side, the tennis bracelet no longer gleaming quite so proudly. Her other hand clutched her designer bag like a shield, though its expensive leather offered no protection against the truth she was facing. "The mark you left." The guard's eyes flickered briefly to the growing crowd. "Will fade in minutes. But the mark you've left on your own character, that will last considerably longer." His gaze returned to her, carrying not just authority now, but something closer to pity. "Was it worth it, madam? Did striking a combat veteran make you feel more important?" I didn't," Isabella stammered, her carefully constructed world of privilege beginning to crack like thin ice under summer sun. Her designer sunglasses slipped from her perfectly coiffed hair, clattering to the cobblestones unnoticed. The veteran stepped forward, his bearing still military straight despite his age. "2 tours in Helmand province," he said, his voice carrying the gravelly weight of experience. "That's what the medal on his chest represents, the one you just assaulted." He gestured to his own decorations. "I earned mine in the Falklands, watching men younger than him make sacrifices you couldn't begin to comprehend." A younger man stepped forward from the crowd, his bearing marking him as military despite his civilian clothes. "Royal Marines, sir," he addressed the guard with quiet respect. "Your unit provided cover for our evacuation in Helmand. Lost 2 of your own, making sure our wounded got out." The guard nodded almost imperceptibly, the shared sacrifice hanging unspoken in the air between them. Isabella's face had lost all color, her earlier bravado replaced by the dawning realization of exactly what kind of man she had struck. The morning sun, now high over Windsor Castle, cast no shadows long enough for her to hide in. "The bearskin cap you mocked." The veteran's voice took on an edge of steel earned in battle. "Represents more than 2 centuries of service to crown and country. Every part of this uniform tells a story of sacrifice, duty, and honor, concepts that clearly need explaining to someone who measures worth by the price of their handbag." Isabella's grip on her Louis Vuitton had loosened, the status symbol suddenly seeming as insignificant as her social media following. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the shame that was beginning to color her cheeks. The courtyard had grown so quiet that the rustle of autumn leaves scraping across cobblestones sounded like thunder. "I've watched men die wearing this uniform," Reginald spoke again, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded in battle, not just boardrooms. "Young men, brave men, who understood something you clearly don't. That some things in this world are worth standing for, worth sacrificing for, worth protecting. Not because they bring wealth or status, but because they represent values greater than any individual." 2 police officers had appeared at the edge of the crowd, their presence professional but unhurried. They recognized what was happening, not just an arrest in the making, but a necessary lesson being delivered with surgical precision. Their radios remained silent as they watched the scene unfold. "Each morning," the guard continued, the red mark on his cheek now fading like Isabella's pretensions of superiority, "we spend hours preparing this uniform. Not for tourist photos, not for show, but out of respect for every man and woman who has worn it before us, who has died wearing it, who understood its true meaning." The veteran touched his campaign medals again, each one a testament to battles fought long ago. "The discipline you mocked, It's not an act. It's the same discipline that keeps men standing their ground under fire, that helps them put duty before comfort, service before self. Something that can't be bought with any amount of charity gala tickets or social media influence. A group of Japanese tourists who had been filming earlier had long since lowered their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more significant than viral content. One of them, an elderly man, bowed deeply toward the guard, a gesture of respect that transcended language and culture. "Did you know," another veteran stepped forward, his accent marking him as Scottish, "that the regiment this young man serves in lost 37 men in Afghanistan?" His voice carried the weight of someone who had counted similar losses. "While you were concerning yourself with social climbing and country club memberships, men wearing this uniform were patrolling Helmand Province, risking their lives to protect the very freedoms you take for granted." Isabella's designer glasses lay forgotten at her feet, one lens cracked, a fitting metaphor for her shattered worldview. Her hands trembled as she tried to compose herself, but the perfectly manicured fingers that had so confidently wielded social authority now seemed to betray her uncertainty. "I watched 2 of my men sacrifice their lives." Reginald's voice remained steady, but carried an undercurrent of emotion that made Isabella's earlier theatrics seem hollow. "They threw themselves on a grenade to save a group of local school children. They wore this same uniform, stood at this same post during their ceremonial duties. The medals you sneered at? They were awarded posthumously." A young woman in the crowd who had been quietly watching the scene unfold stepped forward. "Captain Morrison," she addressed the guard, her voice thick with emotion. "You may not remember me, but you saved my brother in Helmand. He was with the Royal Engineers. You carried him 3 miles under enemy fire after his unit was ambushed." The guard's acknowledgement was subtle, the slightest nod, but it carried more genuine authority than all of Isabella's social posturing. The young woman turned to Isabella, her eyes sharp with controlled anger. "While you were planning your next charity gala, this man was earning his medals with blood and courage." 2 more police officers had arrived, one of them wearing sergeant's stripes. He surveyed the scene with the experienced eye of someone who had dealt with entitled behavior before, but even he seemed moved by the weight of the moment. "The law regarding assault of a royal guard is quite clear," he stated, his voice professional but carrying an edge of personal disapproval. "But more than any legal consequence, you'll have to live with the knowledge that your moment of entitlement led you to strike a decorated combat veteran, someone who's bled for the freedoms you clearly don't appreciate." Isabella's expensive mascara had begun to run, leaving dark tracks down her cheeks. Her earlier bravado had crumbled entirely, replaced by the hollow realization of someone seeing themselves clearly for the first time. The morning sun now stood high over Windsor Castle, casting no shadows long enough to hide her shame. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of autumn leaves. "I never thought—" "No," the first veteran interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "You didn't think. You saw a uniform and assumed it was a costume. You saw discipline and mistook it for weakness. You saw tradition and confused it with theater." He straightened his jacket, his medals catching the late morning light. "That's the problem with people like you. You've spent so long believing money equals respect that you've forgotten what real strength looks like." The police sergeant stepped forward, his movements deliberate and measured. "Mrs. Blackwood Pierce," he began, his tone carrying the weight of both law and tradition, "you'll need to come with us. Assaulting a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces is a serious offense, ceremonial duty or not." Isabella's designer handbag slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft thud on the ancient cobblestones. The sound seemed to echo her falling status, the carefully cultivated image of social importance crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. Her perfectly manicured hands, one of which had so recently committed assault, now trembled as reality crashed through her wall of privilege. "But my husband's connections," she whispered, her voice having lost all its previous authority. "Surely we can handle this unprivately." The word privately carried the desperate hope of someone who still believed money could solve any problem, buy any forgiveness. The female police officer who had joined them, Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews, as her badge proclaimed, stepped forward. Mrs. Blackwood Pierce, this isn't one of your charity galas where social connections determine outcomes. This is a criminal offense against a decorated military veteran. The morning sun had reached its full strength now, illuminating the courtyard with unforgiving clarity. Every eye was focused on Isabella, but not in the way she had always craved attention. The crowd's expressions ranged from disappointment to outright disgust, with not a single face showing the deference she'd come to expect. "Do you know?" the Scottish veteran spoke again, his voice carrying decades of military experience, "that every guard who stands at this post must have a minimum of 2 years active service. The ceremonial duty you dismissed so easily is considered one of the highest honors in the British military." A young man in the crowd wearing a University of Edinburgh sweatshirt raised his hand tentatively. "Sir," he addressed Reginald, "I've been researching the Guards regiments for my thesis. Your unit's actions in Helmand Province are actually part of my case study on modern military heroism." Reginald maintained his forward gaze, but something in his bearing acknowledged the young scholar's words. The red mark on his cheek had faded completely now, but the lesson he'd helped deliver would leave a far more lasting impression on everyone who'd witnessed it. "The bearskin cap alone," the student continued, his academic knowledge adding another layer to the unfolding drama, "weighs nearly 2 pounds. These guards stand at attention for hours in all weather conditions, carrying over 30 pounds of ceremonial gear, and that's after years of active combat service." Detective Inspector Matthews produced a small notebook, her pen poised with professional efficiency. "We'll need statements from witnesses," she announced, her eyes scanning the crowd, "though I doubt we'll have any shortage of those given the circumstances." The elderly veteran stepped forward once more, his campaign medals catching the light. "I'd be happy to provide a statement, Detective, including the part where this lady—" He glanced at Isabella with a mixture of pity and disappointment, mocked the sacrifice of fallen soldiers by calling their uniform a costume. Isabella's expensive makeup couldn't hide her growing pallor. Her carefully styled hair had begun to lose its perfect arrangement, much like her carefully constructed world was coming undone. "My social committee," she began weakly, "the hospital board—" "Will probably be very interested to hear about this incident," Detective Inspector Matthews finished for her, her tone professional but carrying an edge of personal disapproval. Assaulting a combat veteran doesn't typically align with charitable organizations' values. A young mother in the crowd, who had been quietly watching while holding her daughter's hand, spoke up. "I'm on the board of the Royal London Hospital's Charitable Trust," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Mrs. Blackwood Pierce, expect my motion for your removal at the next emergency meeting." The words seemed to hit Isabella harder than any police charge. Her social world, built on carefully cultivated connections and purchased influence, was beginning to collapse like a house of cards in a strong wind. Her knees buckled slightly, and one of the police officers stepped forward to steady her. "Come along, madam," he said, firm but not unkind. "We'll need you to come to the station to process this formally." He reached down to retrieve her fallen handbag, handling the expensive accessory with professional detachment, as if it were any other piece of evidence. As the police began to lead Isabella away, the young girl whose mother had revealed her position on the hospital board tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mummy," she asked in that carrying whisper that only children seem to master, "why did the fancy lady think being rich made it okay to be mean?" The question hung in the air, its innocent wisdom cutting through the complexity of adult social hierarchies. Several members of the crowd nodded, the child's simple observation capturing the essence of what they'd all witnessed. The guard had resumed his position, his bearing as perfect as it had been before Isabella's assault. But there was something different now, a tangible aura of authority that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with the warrior beneath the uniform. The morning sun gleamed off his ceremonial rifle, each polished surface reflecting the dedication that Isabella had failed to recognize. As Isabella was being led away by the police, her Louboutin heels no longer striking the cobblestones with their previous authority, the elderly veteran turned to address the crowd that had witnessed this remarkable display of dignity over entitlement. "Take a good look," he said, gesturing toward Reginald, who maintained his post with unwavering discipline. "That man you just saw? He'll continue standing his watch with the same dedication he showed under that woman's attack, the same dedication he showed under enemy fire in Afghanistan. Not because it's his job, but because he understands something that money can't buy. True respect isn't demanded, it's earned." Martha Higgins, the tour coordinator who had first encountered Isabella's entitled behavior, stepped forward to retrieve the fallen designer sunglasses. She handled them with careful professionalism. Had spoken earlier about his thesis, raised his hand again. "Ma'am, if I might add, the Guards regiments have a saying, 'Ceremonial duty is the public face of private sacrifice.' Today we all witnessed exactly what that means." A distinguished-looking gentleman in a well-tailored suit stepped forward from the crowd. His bearing suggested military background, though he wore no visible medals. "Wing Commander James Harrison, retired," he introduced himself. "I served with Reginald's father in the RAF, the same father who died on a rescue mission in Iraq, saving 3 of his fellow airmen." The revelation sent a ripple through the crowd. The guard's posture remained perfect, but those watching closely might have noticed the slightest tightening around his eyes at the mention of his father. "His dad received the Distinguished Flying Cross posthumously," the wing commander continued, his voice thick with emotion. "The same dedication to duty that cost him his life lives on in his son. That's the heritage this woman dismissed as a costume." Detective Inspector Matthews, who had returned after escorting Isabella to the police vehicle, pulled out her notebook again. "Wing Commander, if you wouldn't mind providing a statement as well? The more we understand about the gravity of this incident, the better." The young mother who had revealed her hospital board position approached the detective. "I've already contacted our board secretary," she said, her voice firm with purpose. "We're calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Mrs. Blackwood Pierce's behavior is completely incompatible with our values of service and compassion." An older gentleman in a Savile Row suit cleared his throat. "Charles Pembroke, chairman of the Kensington Heritage Society," he announced, his cultured accent carrying just a hint of controlled anger. "I believe Mrs. Blackwood Pierce waved around her membership in our organization as if it were some sort of diplomatic immunity. Rest assured, that membership will be terminated by this evening." The morning sun had reached its zenith now, casting no shadows in which to hide uncomfortable truths. A group of school children on a field trip had gathered at a respectful distance, their teacher using the moment as an impromptu lesson about respect and service. "You see, children," she explained in a carrying whisper, "standing guard here isn't about wearing a fancy uniform or being part of a tourist attraction. It's about honoring a tradition of service that goes back centuries, service that sometimes demands the ultimate sacrifice." One of the police officers who had remained behind approached the veteran who had spoken earlier. "Sir, we've been informed that similar incidents have occurred at other royal sites. Would you be willing to participate in an educational program? Share your experiences with visitors about the real meaning behind the ceremonial duties?" The veteran straightened his jacket, his medals catching the light. "Gladly, Constable. Perhaps if more people understood that these guards aren't decorative features but combat veterans, they'd think twice before treating them like tourist attractions." Martha, who had been organizing the gathering crowd with practiced efficiency, turned to the wing commander. "Sir, would you consider contributing to our visitor orientation program? Your perspective could help prevent future incidents." The watching tourists had begun to disperse, but many lingered, still processing what they had witnessed. A French family approached one of the police officers, the father speaking in careful English. "In France, we have our own ceremonial guards," he explained. "But today we learned something profound about British dignity. Our children will not forget this lesson." Detective Inspector Matthews finished making her notes and approached the guard's position. "Captain Morrison," she addressed him formally, "we'll need your official statement when your duty shift ends. But I want you to know, in 20 years of police work, I've never seen someone handle assault with more dignity." The guard's forward gaze remained unchanged, but there was a subtle acknowledgement in his bearing. The red mark on his cheek had completely vanished now, unlike the lasting impression this incident would leave on everyone who had witnessed it. A young constable, newly graduated from training, watched the scene with wide eyes. The composure, He whispered to his sergeant. The discipline, even after being struck. That's what real authority looks like, lad. The sergeant responded quietly. Not the kind that comes with a price tag, but the kind that's earned through service and sacrifice. The news of Isabella's assault spread through London's social circles faster than the autumn breeze that now rustled through Windsor Castle's courtyard. By early afternoon, her carefully curated world had begun to unravel with remarkable speed. Her phone, sitting in an evidence bag at the police station, buzzed continuously with notifications as social committees, charity boards, and exclusive clubs all moved to distance themselves from her actions. At the castle, the incident had transformed into something more meaningful than just another entitled tourist's meltdown. Tour groups now paused at the spot where it had happened, guides incorporating the morning's events into their presentations about the guard's dedication and service. You see this post where the guard stands? One guide explained to her attentive group. Every guard who serves here has faced real combat. The gentleman on duty this morning, Captain Morrison, led a rescue mission in Helmand Province that saved 16 British soldiers and 23 Afghan civilians. An American couple at the back of the tour group exchanged glances. The husband, wearing a U.S. Marine Corps veteran's cap, nodded solemnly. Different uniform, same spirit of service, he commented to his wife. Some people just don't understand the weight of tradition these men carry. Inside the police station, Detective Inspector Matthews was conducting a formal interview with Isabella, whose designer outfit now seemed incongruously out of place under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interview room. Mrs. Blackwood Pierce, the detective began, her tone professional but stern. Do you understand that in addition to assault, you're being charged with causing public disturbance and showing contempt for a protected ceremonial position? Isabella's response was barely audible, her voice having lost all its previous self-importance. Her makeup, which had cost more than a guard's daily wage, was streaked with tears. I never meant... I didn't know. That's precisely the problem, isn't it? Matthews interrupted, years of experience evident in her voice. You didn't know because you never bothered to look beyond the surface. That costume you mocked? It represents over 300 years of military tradition? Those theatrical movements? Their military drill perfected through centuries of service. Back at the castle, the elderly veteran had been invited to speak with a group of visiting schoolchildren. He stood straight despite his age, his medals catching the sunlight as he addressed the young audience. You see these medals? He asked, touching the ribbons on his chest. Each one tells a story of sacrifice. The guard you saw this morning, he has twice as many, all earned in active combat. When people like that lady this morning see us standing guard, they think we're just part of the tourist attraction. They don't see the nights spent in desert storms, the friends we've lost, the sacrifices made. The children listened with rapt attention, their usual restlessness replaced by genuine interest. One small boy raised his hand. Sir, is it hard to stand so still for so long? The veteran smiled. Not nearly as hard as watching your brothers in arms risk their lives in combat. That's what gives these guards their discipline, not the ceremony but the real service behind it. At the local magistrate's office, preparations were already underway for Isabella's hearing. The court clerk, a former military man himself, reviewed the charges with particular attention to detail. We've had entitled tourists before, he explained to his colleague, but assaulting a decorated combat veteran performing ceremonial duties? That's going to require a special kind of response. Social media had caught wind of the incident, with videos of Isabella's meltdown spreading rapidly. But unlike typical viral content, the focus wasn't on mockery or entertainment. Comment sections filled with veterans sharing their own stories of service, creating an impromptu educational forum about the meaning behind ceremonial duties. When I served in the Guards, one comment read, we had a saying, we stand guard today because our brothers died standing guard yesterday. It's not about the ceremony, it's about honoring their sacrifice. Martha Higgins had begun updating the castle's visitor guidelines, working with the wing commander to craft a new section about the Guard's service background. We need to make it clear, she explained to her staff, that these men aren't actors in a tourist attraction. They're combat veterans continuing their service in a ceremonial role. The young university student who had spoken about his thesis approached Martha with an idea. What if we created an educational display? Something that shows the connection between ceremonial duty and active service? People might think twice about treating the guards like tourist attractions if they understood their combat experience. In her holding cell, Isabella sat alone with her thoughts, her designer outfit wrinkled, her perfectly manicured nails nervously tapping against the bench. Through the small window, she could see the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, much like the ones that had witnessed her moment of entitled rage that morning. A female officer brought her a cup of tea, not the premium blend she was used to, but the simple station variety. "You know," the officer said kindly but firmly, "Captain Morrison's unit lost 3 men saving a village from Taliban forces. The little hat you mocked? He wore it at their memorial service before returning to combat duty the next day." The words seemed to hit Isabella harder than any formal charge. She stared into the paper cup, seeing her distorted reflection in the tea's surface, a reflection that showed her not as the social elite she'd imagined herself to be, but as someone who had fundamentally misunderstood the difference between status and respect. The following day dawned crisp and clear over Windsor Castle, but the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Tourists approached the guards' posts with newfound respect, many stopping to read a hastily assembled but dignified temporary display about the guards' military service that Martha had organized overnight. At the Royal London Hospital's emergency board meeting, the discussion was brief but decisive. Isabella Blackwood Pierce's name was struck from all committees, her donations respectfully returned, her charitable initiatives reassigned to others. The young mother who had spoken up at the incident presided over the meeting with quiet authority. "It's not about the money," she explained to the board members, some of whom had expressed concern about losing a major donor. "Our hospital was founded on principles of service and compassion. We cannot maintain associations with someone who publicly assaulted a combat veteran performing his ceremonial duties." Meanwhile, at the police station, Detective Inspector Matthews reviewed the growing pile of witness statements. The stories painted a consistent picture, but what struck her most were the additional details people had come forward with about Captain Morrison's service record. "Sir," she addressed her superintendent, "I've received calls from 3 different military units. Apparently the guard Mrs. Blackwood Pierce assaulted wasn't just any veteran. He led one of the most successful humanitarian missions in Helmand Province, evacuating an entire village under heavy fire." The superintendent, a former Royal Marine himself, nodded gravely. "And now he stands guard over our traditions, only to be treated like a theme park character by someone who's never understood the meaning of service." At the Kensington Heritage Society's offices, Charles Pembroke was drafting a public statement. His secretary had informed him that several other members had threatened to resign if decisive action wasn't taken regarding Isabella's behavior. "The Society hereby reaffirms its commitment to preserving and honoring British traditions," he dictated, his cultured voice firm with conviction. "Mrs. Blackwood Pierce's actions represent a fundamental misunderstanding of the heritage we exist to protect. Her membership has been terminated with immediate effect." Back at Windsor Castle, the elderly veteran had been invited to contribute to a new training program for tour guides. He stood in the staff room, his medals catching the morning light as he addressed the assembled guides. "What happened yesterday wasn't just about one entitled woman's behavior," he explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "It was about the disconnect between those who buy their way into social positions and those who earn their place through service and sacrifice." Martha Higgins nodded in agreement, adding, "We're updating our visitor materials to include more information about the Guard's military service. People need to understand that these aren't ceremonial positions filled by actors. They're combat veterans continuing their service in a different but equally important way." The university student who had witnessed the incident was furiously revising his thesis. "Yesterday provided a perfect case study," he explained to his professor via video call. "The intersection of ceremony and service, the clash between purchased status and earned respect, it encapsulates everything I've been researching about modern military tradition." In the magistrate's office, the clerk finished processing Isabella's case file. The charges were serious: assault on a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces, disturbing the peace, and showing contempt for a protected ceremonial position. But beyond the legal ramifications, it was the social fallout that would likely impact her most severely. Her solicitor called, one clerk mentioned to another. Apparently, she's already been dropped from 3 charity boards, 2 social committees, and the hospital trust. Turns out money can't buy your way out of assaulting a war hero. At the castle's visitor center, a group of schoolchildren gathered around a new interactive display about the Guards' service. Their teacher, a former army nurse, explained the significance of each medal and decoration shown in the photographs. These men, she told her attentive students, stand guard not because it's their job, but because they understand something very important about duty and respect. They've earned their place through service and sacrifice, not through wealth or social status. The wing commander had returned to contribute to the new educational initiative. He stood beside a photograph of guards performing their ceremonial duties, addressing a group of international tourists. What you see here, the precision, the discipline, the unwavering dedication, these aren't theatrical elements, he explained. They're the same qualities that keep these men alive in combat zones, that help them save their comrades under fire, that make them the elite soldiers they are. In her solicitor's office, Isabella sat quietly as he explained the severity of her situation. Her designer outfit, though still immaculate, seemed to have lost its power to command respect. The morning papers lay on the desk between them, several featuring articles about the incident and its broader implications for society's understanding of military service. The guard you assaulted, her solicitor explained gently but firmly, has received commendations from 3 different countries for his service in Afghanistan. The costume you mocked has been awarded multiple times for valor under fire. This isn't just about assault charges, Mrs. Blackwood-Pierce. This is about fundamentally misunderstanding the relationship between wealth and worth. The autumn sun climbed higher over Windsor Castle, where Reginald Morrison continued his watch with the same unwavering dedication he'd shown the day before. But now, tourists approached his post differently, not with the entitled curiosity of those seeking a photo opportunity, but with the respectful appreciation of those who understood that sometimes the most important service comes wrapped in ceremony. A week after the incident, Windsor Castle had transformed in subtle but significant ways. The spot where Isabella Blackwood-Pierce's sense of entitlement had collided with unwavering dignity now featured a dignified plaque, tastefully describing the Guards Regiment's service history. Tour groups paused there regularly, listening as guides shared stories not just of ceremonial duty, but of real sacrifice and service. The magistrate's verdict had been delivered with measured severity. Isabella faced not only a substantial fine but also mandatory community service, specifically helping to organize veteran support programs. It was a sentence designed not just to punish, but to educate and transform. Perhaps, the magistrate had said, his voice carrying decades of judicial wisdom, working directly with veterans will help you understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice, the very qualities you dismissed as mere ceremony last week. In the elegant conference room of the Royal London Hospital's charity wing, a different kind of transformation was taking place. The board meeting's minutes recorded a unanimous decision to redirect their fundraising focus toward veteran support programs. The young mother who had witnessed the incident, now heading the initiative, addressed her colleagues. "Last week's events showed us something important," she explained, her voice carrying quiet authority. "We've been measuring success by the size of donations rather than the depth of commitment to service. That changes today." At the castle's visitor center, Martha Higgins supervised the installation of a new permanent exhibition. Photographs of guards in ceremonial duty were displayed alongside images of their combat service, a powerful reminder that beneath the ceremonial uniform lay years of battlefield experience. "It's remarkable," she commented to the wing commander, who had become a regular advisor. "Since we installed these displays, we haven't had a single incident of disrespect toward the guards. When people understand the service behind the ceremony, their behavior changes naturally." The university student's thesis had evolved into something more significant. Working with military historians and veteran organizations, He was now developing a comprehensive educational program about the relationship between ceremonial duties and active service. What happened that day, he explained to a colleague, wasn't just about one woman's actions. It was about the clash between two very different ways of understanding authority, one earned through service and sacrifice, the other purchased through wealth and social position. In London's exclusive social circles, Isabella's absence was noted, but not in the ways she would have once expected. Her former social peers had begun examining their own attitudes towards service and ceremony. Several prominent figures had quietly increased their support of veteran causes, not for social recognition, but out of genuine respect. Captain Reginald Morrison continued his duties with unchanged dedication, though his story had become part of the Guard's unofficial lore. New recruits to ceremonial duty were told about his response to assault, not as a tale of confrontation, but as an example of how true authority commands respect without demanding it. The elderly veteran who had spoken up that day had become something of an unofficial ambassador, sharing his experiences with visitor groups. Today he stood before a group of international tourists, his medals catching the autumn sunlight. "These ceremonies you see," he explained, gesturing toward the guards at their posts, "they're not performances for tourists. They're living links to centuries of service and sacrifice. Each guard you see has faced combat, has lost comrades, has demonstrated valor under fire. The discipline you witness isn't rehearsed. It's ingrained through real military service." A young girl in his audience raised her hand. "But why do they have to stand so still?" she asked, echoing the question many children had posed before. The veteran smiled gently. "The same discipline that keeps them still on duty once kept them steady under enemy fire. The same dedication that makes them perfect in ceremony once made them reliable in combat. These aren't two different things. They're the same quality of character expressed in different ways." In her solicitor's office, Isabella reviewed the terms of her sentence. Her once immaculate appearance had softened somehow, the designer labels less prominent, the status symbols less aggressively displayed. The past week had stripped away more than just her social positions. It had forced her to confront fundamental truths about respect and worth. "Your first assignment at the Veterans Center begins Monday," her solicitor explained, reviewing the documents. "They're expecting you at 0800 hours. The use of military time was deliberate, a small reminder of the world she would need to understand. Back at Windsor Castle, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, much like it had on that fateful morning. But now, tourists approached the guards' posts with visible respect, many stopping to read about their service records before quietly taking photos from a respectful distance. A group of school children on a field trip listened attentively as their guide explained the meaning behind each element of the guard's uniform. "These aren't costumes," she emphasized. "They're symbols of service. Each button, each medal, each movement has been earned through real sacrifice." The wing commander, observing the scene, turned to Martha. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes it takes a moment of confrontation to remind us all why these traditions exist. They're not just about maintaining ceremony. They're about honoring the connection between past service and present duty." As the day drew to a close, the changing of the guard proceeded with its usual precision. But now, the watching crowd understood they weren't just witnessing a tourist attraction. They were observing a living tradition of service, dedication, and unwavering dignity. 1 month after the incident that had transformed Windsor Castle's approach to ceremonial duty, the autumn leaves had given way to winter's first frost. The morning sun cast a crystalline glow across the courtyard where Captain Reginald Morrison stood at his post, his breath visible in the crisp air, but his bearing as unwavering as ever. In the visitor center, now transformed into an educational space that bridged ceremony and service, Martha Higgins was hosting a special presentation. The audience included tour operators from across Britain's historic sites, all eager to learn from what had become known as the Windsor incident. "What happened that day," Martha explained, gesturing toward a photograph of a guard at attention, "wasn't just about one woman's misunderstanding of authority. It became a catalyst for changing how we present and protect our traditions." The elderly veteran, now a regular speaker at these sessions, stood beside a display of military medals and decorations. "These guards you see," he addressed the group, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "They've earned their positions through blood and sacrifice." The lady who thought she could slap away their dignity didn't understand that real authority can't be purchased. It can only be earned through service. At the Royal London Hospital, the charitable foundation had undergone its own transformation. The conference room where Isabella had once dominated discussions now hosted veterans sharing their experiences with medical students. The young mother who had witnessed the incident had established a new program, linking medical training with veteran support services. "Sometimes," she told her colleagues, "it takes a moment of conflict to show us where our true priorities should lie." Mrs. Blackwood Pierce's actions taught us that status without substance is meaningless. Isabella herself had changed in ways she never expected. Her community service at the Veterans Center had stripped away her artificial sense of importance, replacing it with something more genuine. Today, she sat quietly in a corner of the center, listening to a young veteran describe his experiences in Afghanistan. Gone were the designer labels she had once wielded like weapons. Her appearance, while still elegant, had softened into something more authentic. The transformation went deeper than clothes. It showed in her eyes, in the way she listened rather than demanded attention. "I never understood," she confided to her counselor during their weekly session, "that the ceremonies I dismissed as theater were actually expressions of something far more profound. Each guard standing at attention has faced dangers I can't imagine, shown courage I never knew existed." The university students' educational program had been adopted by historical sites across Britain. Today, he stood before a group of international tourism officials, explaining the importance of understanding military tradition. "What we learned from that incident," he explained, pointing to a presentation slide, "is that ceremonial duty isn't about maintaining a tourist attraction. It's about honoring a continuum of service that stretches from the battlefields of the past to the guards standing watch today." In the castle courtyard, tourists now approached the guards' posts differently. They still took photographs, still admired the ceremonial precision, but there was a new understanding in their behavior. Children no longer mimicked the guards' stance for amusing photos. Instead, they asked their parents about the medals, about the service they represented. The wing commander, reviewing the changes with castle staff, nodded approvingly. "It's remarkable," he observed, "how one moment of confrontation between entitlement and earned authority could lead to such profound changes in public understanding." Detective Inspector Matthews, who had handled Isabella's case, now used it as a teaching example for new officers. "The law protects these ceremonial positions," she explained to her trainees, "not because they're tourist attractions, but because they represent the ongoing dedication of our armed forces. Each guard you see has earned their position through active service." At the Veterans Center, where Isabella continued her community service, a young soldier recently returned from deployment shared his perspective. "Standing guard at these posts," he explained, "isn't a step down from active duty. It's a different kind of service requiring the same discipline that kept us alive in combat." The magistrate who had sentenced Isabella received regular reports on her progress. Today, reviewing her counselor's latest update, he allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes, he mused to his clerk, the most effective sentences are those that educate rather than simply punish. As winter's early darkness began to fall over Windsor Castle, the changing of the guard proceeded with its timeless precision. Tourists watched in respectful silence, many having visited the new educational center first to understand the true significance of what they were witnessing. Captain Morrison, completing his watch, stood as steadfast as ever. The spot where Isabella had struck him now marked not a moment of shame, but a point of transformation, where artificial authority had collided with real service, and respect had triumphed over entitlement. The lesson of that autumn morning had rippled out far beyond Windsor's walls, touching something fundamental about how society views service, ceremony, and respect. It reminded everyone that true authority isn't marked by designer labels or social status, but by the willingness to stand in service to something greater than oneself. As night fell over the ancient stones of Windsor Castle, the guards continued their eternal watch, their dedication unchanged by the passing drama of entitled tourists or social pretensions. They stood as they always had, as they always would, guardians not just of a palace, but of principles that wealth could never buy and status could never command. How far should respect for tradition and authority extend? It's a question that the events at Windsor Castle that autumn morning answered in ways that continue to resonate throughout British society. While Isabella Blackwood Pierce had thought she was confronting a mere symbol, what she actually faced was the unwavering strength of real service, the kind that's earned through sacrifice, not bought with status. The incident sparked discussions far beyond the castle walls. In London's prestigious private clubs, where wealth had often been the primary measure of worth, conversations shifted subtly but significantly. The question was no longer about who could afford the highest membership fees, but about what members contributed to society beyond their bank balances. At the Kensington Heritage Society's annual meeting, Charles Pembroke addressed the assembled members with newfound perspective. "Our purpose," he declared, "isn't to preserve traditions as museum pieces, but to understand and honor the living service they represent." The guard who faced that assault with such dignity didn't learn his composure from a ceremonial handbook. He learned it under enemy fire, protecting the very freedoms some take for granted. The Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst incorporated the incident into their leadership training curriculum. Major Sarah Henderson, addressing a class of officer cadets, used it to illustrate a crucial point about authority. Real leadership, she explained, isn't about demanding respect through social position or wealth. It's about earning it through service, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to duty. The guard in this incident demonstrated more authority in his silence than his attacker did in all her entitled demands. In Britain's top boarding schools, where the next generation of privileged youth was being educated, the story became a teaching tool about the true nature of social responsibility. At Eton College, a history master used it in his lessons about tradition and service. "Consider," he told his students, "the difference between inherited privilege and earned authority." The guard who was assaulted that day had earned his position through combat service, through sacrifice, through dedication to something greater than himself. His attacker, despite all her social connections, demonstrated only that wealth without wisdom leads to entitlement. The incident's impact reached even Parliament, where discussions about protecting ceremonial positions took on new urgency. A member of the House of Lords, himself a decorated veteran, spoke passionately about the deeper meaning of these traditions. These ceremonies, he argued, aren't theatrical performances for tourists. They're living links to centuries of service and sacrifice. Each guard standing watch represents not just tradition, but active duty soldiers who've faced combat, who've lost comrades, who understand that true authority comes from service rather than status. In veterans organizations across the country, the story became a rallying point for discussions about how military service is viewed in modern society. At a Royal British Legion meeting in Manchester, a former sergeant major addressed his colleagues. "That guard's response," he noted, "showed everything we learn in service: discipline, dignity, and the understanding that true strength isn't about dominating others, but about standing firm in your principles, no matter the provocation." Media coverage of the incident evolved from initial sensationalism to thoughtful analysis. A respected Sunday Times columnist wrote, "What we witnessed at Windsor wasn't just a clash between entitlement and duty. It was a moment that forced our society to confront its assumptions about authority, respect, and the true meaning of service." International tourism organizations began revising their guidelines for visitors to military ceremonies worldwide. The World Tourism Federation issued new recommendations emphasizing the importance of understanding the military service behind ceremonial positions. "These aren't photo opportunities," their guide now stated. "They're active duty soldiers performing a different kind of service. The discipline you see isn't rehearsed. It's ingrained through real military experience." Social media influencers, who had initially shared the video for entertainment, began creating content about military service and respect. One prominent YouTuber produced a documentary series about guards' combat experiences, helping younger audiences understand the reality behind the ceremony. In corporate leadership seminars, the incident became a case study in the difference between positional authority and earned respect. A prominent business school professor used it to challenge executives' assumptions about leadership. "Consider," she would tell her students, Why the guard's silent dignity commanded more respect than all his attackers' wealthy declarations. Real authority doesn't need to announce itself. It's evident in how we serve others, not in how we serve ourselves. As winter settled over Windsor Castle, the lessons of that autumn morning continued to resonate. Each frost-covered morning, as guards took their posts with unwavering dedication, visitors approached with new understanding. They saw not just ceremonial precision, but the living embodiment of service and sacrifice. The question remains for all of us. How do we measure true worth in our society? Is it through the labels we wear, the social circles we move in, the wealth we display? Or is it, as that guard demonstrated, through our dedication to something greater than ourselves, our willingness to serve, our ability to maintain dignity even in the face of disrespect? Share your thoughts in the comments below. When was the last time you mistook ceremony for weakness or tradition for mere performance? How often do we let our own sense of entitlement blind us to the deeper meanings of duty and honor? Remember, every uniform tells a story, every tradition carries a weight, and every post, no matter how ceremonial it might appear, represents values worth standing for. Sometimes it takes a moment of conflict to reveal eternal truths about respect, service, and the real meaning of authority. The events that unfolded at Windsor Castle that autumn morning did more than teach one entitled woman a lesson. They sparked a conversation about values that continues to resonate throughout society. As we reflect on this encounter, perhaps we should ask ourselves, what truly commands respect in our world? Is it the expensive labels we wear, the social positions we buy, or the authority we try to purchase through wealth? Or is it, as that guard demonstrated, the quiet dignity that comes from years of real service and sacrifice? The guard's response wasn't just a defense of his position. It was a powerful reminder that true authority comes not from wealth or social standing, but from the values we choose to stand for. While Isabella Blackwood Pierce thought she was confronting a mere ceremonial figure, she actually faced something far more powerful, the unwavering strength of earned respect. Consider how this story has transformed those who witnessed it. Tour guides at Windsor Castle now speak not just of ceremonial traditions, but of the combat veterans who maintain them. Children ask not about the fancy uniforms, but about the medals and what they represent. Even social media, usually focused on viral moments of conflict, has turned this incident into a discussion about service, sacrifice, and genuine respect. The veteran who spoke up that day continues to share his experiences with visitors, helping them understand that every guard they see has faced real combat, lost real comrades, and earned their position through real sacrifice. His message resonates because it speaks to something we all inherently understand, but sometimes forget: that true worth can't be bought with any amount of money or social influence. In police stations across Britain, officers use this incident in their training, not just as an example of assault, but as a lesson in the difference between demanded respect and earned authority. They understand that the guard's response, maintaining dignity while standing firm in his principles, represents the highest form of professional conduct. Military academies have incorporated this story into their leadership courses, using it to demonstrate that real authority doesn't need to announce itself. It's visible in how we serve others, not in how we demand others serve us. The guard's unwavering stance, they teach, showed more true leadership than all of Isabella's entitled declarations. Educational programs at historic sites now emphasize that ceremonial duties aren't performed by actors, but by combat veterans continuing their service in a different form. They help visitors understand that the precision they witness isn't theatrical. It's the same discipline that kept these soldiers alive in combat zones. Social clubs and charity boards across London have learned their own lessons from this incident. They've begun measuring members not by the size of their donations or the exclusivity of their connections, but by their understanding of service and their contribution to society's greater good. The transformation of Isabella Blackwood Pierce herself serves as a powerful reminder that it's never too late to learn about real respect and dignity. Through her mandated service at veteran centers, she discovered that true authority isn't something you can purchase with designer labels or social connections. It's something you earn through dedication to values greater than yourself. As winter settles over Windsor Castle, the guards continue their eternal watch, their dedication unchanged by passing dramas or social pretensions. They stand as they always have, as they always will. Guardians not just of a palace, but of principles that wealth could never buy and status could never command. For those who visit Windsor Castle now, the experience has become more than just a tourist attraction. It's a reminder that beneath every ceremonial uniform beats the heart of a warrior who has faced real combat, who has demonstrated real courage, who has earned their position through real service. The question for all of us remains, how do we show respect for traditions we might not fully understand? How do we recognize the difference between purchased status and earned authority? When we encounter ceremonies or customs that seem foreign to us, do we approach them with entitled demands, or do we seek to understand the deeper meanings they represent? This story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful responses don't come through words or actions, but through unwavering dignity in the face of disrespect. The guard's silence spoke volumes about the difference between real authority and purchased power. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone mistaking ceremony for weakness? How do you think we can better honor those who serve, whether in military uniform or other forms of public service? Subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us why some traditions are worth preserving and some values are worth protecting. Until next time, remember that true respect, like true service, isn't demanded. It's earned through dedication to something greater than ourselves. The guard's unwavering stance that autumn morning taught us all an unforgettable lesson about honor, service, and the real meaning of authority. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.